A black schoolboy, Marcus, is humiliated by a waiter in a luxury restaurant. The waiter mocks him, unaware that Marcus's father owns the restaurant. When the truth comes out, the waiter faces the consequences of his actions. Marcus gains confidence, and the event sparks changes in the restaurant, promoting respect and inclusivity. A waiter insulted a black schoolboy in a luxury restaurant thinking he was just another privileged kid. What he didn't know was that the boy's father owned the entire restaurant. The moment the waiter realized, it was too late. What seemed like a small mistake turned into a life-altering moment. You won't believe what happened next. This is a story about power, respect, and justice. Stick with us to see how this restaurant mishap turned into something that no one could have predicted. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories. The restaurant's atmosphere is sleek, polished, and sophisticated. The soft glimmer of candlelight illuminates the high-end decor, and the clink of wine glasses creates a gentle hum in the air. Conversations are hushed, filled with the hum of exclusivity as guests enjoy their meals. The space is immaculate, but a certain tension lurks beneath the surface, an unspoken divide between the elite patrons and those who serve them. Enter Marcus Johnson, a 16-year-old black schoolboy, accompanied by his father, a well-dressed middle-aged man who carries the air of success. Marcus stands tall but with a quiet confidence, his posture hinting at the silent strength within him. He's dressed in smart clothes, a blazer over a hoodie, sleek sneakers that add a touch of modern style. His eyes reflect quiet determination, and though his demeanor suggests he's comfortable, he doesn't want to draw attention to himself. Though he enjoys the privileges his father's success affords, Marcus remains humble, aware of how his appearance and age often cause others to misjudge him. He knows the microaggressions that come with his black identity, especially in a place like this. He's used to walking through spaces where people assume he doesn't belong. He doesn't take it personally, but it stings, just like it does now as they walk into the restaurant. The patrons' glances flicker between confusion and curiosity. Some raise their eyebrows, clearly wondering why someone like Marcus is here, as if he doesn't fit the elite mold of the clientele. Marcus's father, a successful businessman and owner of several luxury restaurants, seems entirely at ease. As the two walk into the main dining area, Marcus's father exudes a kind of authority that commands attention without needing to be overt. It's clear that his son has inherited his grace and composure, but Marcus feels the weight of the looks directed his way. Luke Harris, a waiter in his early 30s, watches them enter from the corner of the room. Luke is well-groomed in his uniform, his posture rigid, carrying an air of self-importance. He assumes his role in this environment means that he has a certain power over those who enter. His glance flickers over Marcus, then to his father. But there's an immediate bias in his expression, an assumption that Marcus doesn't belong in this exclusive space. Luke's personality is one of self-assuredness, but with an undercurrent of condescension. He doesn't see much beyond his own narrow worldview. He believes that tradition and the hierarchy within this fine dining world mean that some people are meant to serve, and others, like himself, are to be served. He looks down on those he deems unworthy of his attention, especially those from backgrounds he perceives as less privileged. Luke, growing up in a middle-class environment, has always held tightly to the idea that people must earn their place in society, and it is through his career that he's managed to climb higher up the ladder. In his mind, people like Marcus and his father don't fit the mold, Marcus's youth and appearance make him appear out of place in such an upscale restaurant. As Marcus and his father take their seats, Luke approaches them, seemingly determined, to serve them in the same cold, professional manner he offers to everyone. Except something about this situation feels different. Luke's eyes flicker once more to Marcus, who sits across from his father, trying to ignore the weight of the world on his shoulders. The mood in the room shifts as Luke walks toward their table. There's a moment of uncomfortable silence, and, although no one says anything aloud, the atmosphere in the restaurant has become charged. Marcus feels it. His father notices the glances, and though they don't speak, both father and son know exactly what's at play here. The tension between wealth and appearance and the unspoken judgments about who belongs and who doesn't are about to collide head-on. Luke's discomfort with Marcus, fueled by his own preconceived notions, will soon trigger a series of events that will forever change the dynamics in this restaurant. Little does Luke know, the boy he's about to underestimate has a voice far more powerful than he realizes. Marcus and his father, James Johnson, sat at a table in the heart of the restaurant, a plush velvet booth that had a clear view of the elegantly set dining room. The dim lighting created an intimate atmosphere, with soft jazz playing in the background and the delicate clinking of silverware against fine china. James, a businessman who had made his way from humble beginnings, sat across from his son, enjoying their quiet meal together. Marcus, wearing a blazer over a hoodie, kept his posture relaxed, but his sharp eyes scanned the room. His mind wandered, and he tried to ignore the curious glances from some of the other patrons. It was no secret that he didn't always fit the typical mold of those who dined here. The unspoken tension lingered around him, but he remained calm, choosing to focus on the pleasantness of the moment with his father rather than the judgment he often faced in places like this. Luke, the waiter, approached their table with a crisp step. His uniform was spotless and his posture rigid. He paused briefly, eyeing Marcus and his father. There was a certain coldness in his gaze, an unspoken assumption about who belonged in this upscale restaurant and who did not. With a slight smirk, Luke addressed Marcus, his tone patronizing. "Can I offer you the menu, sir?" Luke said, his voice casual, but there was something in the way he said, "sir," that made it feel more like an afterthought than a sign of respect. Marcus, sensing the condescension in Luke's demeanor, politely nodded and glanced at the menu. When he asked about a dish, one that he had heard the waiter mention earlier, Luke's response was sharp, almost dismissive. "Do you not know what this is?" Luke asked, raising an eyebrow. "You should have done your research before coming. Here, maybe you can't afford this place anyway." A jolt of discomfort shot through Marcus. He had felt the sting of microaggressions countless times before, but it still hurt every time. Despite the slight, Marcus remained composed, his gaze steady as he chose not to react immediately. His father, however, noticed the change in the air. James's brow furrowed as he observed Luke's behavior. His son had faced this kind of treatment before, but it didn't make it any easier to watch. The words hung heavily in the air, and though Marcus didn't react, it was clear that the tension in the room was building. Luke, having seen Marcus's unfazed reaction, grew increasingly irritated. He saw Marcus as just another young, entitled kid, not worthy of the space he occupied. His arrogance began to rise, and instead of backing off, he leaned in a little closer, his tone more biting. "Maybe you should take the time to figure out the kind of place you're stepping into before you try to ask questions," Luke sneered. "This isn't your average restaurant, you know. Some people don't belong here." Marcus felt the sting of the insult, but he didn't engage. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he controlled it. His father, on the other hand, could feel the weight of every word. He knew what was happening. He had seen the microaggressions before, but they still hurt just as much when his son was on the receiving end. James felt the anger rising, but he chose to remain silent, watching the waiter carefully, knowing this wasn't the moment to escalate. The other patrons in the restaurant were starting to notice. A few students from Marcus's school sitting nearby glanced at the table. They sensed the tension but said nothing. They knew Marcus, and some had heard the whispers about him, but this was different. This wasn't the typical classroom or hallway scene. It was public, and it made them uneasy. Whispers began to float between the tables. A couple at a nearby booth exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable with the interaction but unsure of what to do. The entire atmosphere felt suffocating. Now, the quiet hum of conversation was replaced by the thick silence of people wondering whether they should speak up or just keep to themselves. Luke seemed to feel emboldened as the silence deepened. But just as he was about to continue his insults, Marcus's father stood up. His eyes, usually calm and measured, now shone with quiet fury. He looked at Marcus, who met his gaze with a knowing look. This was about to end, one way or another. "Marcus," James said firmly, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant, "let's go. I think this young man has had enough time to embarrass us. But there's something I need him to know first." The air in the room shifted again as every patron turned their attention toward the table. Luke's arrogant smirk wavered. His mind raced. What had just happened? What was Marcus's father about to reveal? The tension that had been building now felt like an impending storm. All eyes were on the table, waiting for the moment that would change everything. The tension in the restaurant had reached a breaking point. As Marcus and his father stood up to leave, the whispers from the other patrons echoed around the room. Some were watching the confrontation, while others remained frozen in place, unsure how to react. The silence was almost deafening. And then, Marcus's father, his voice calm and steady, broke that silence. "I'm the owner of this restaurant," he said, his words carrying across the now still room. The words hit Luke like a slap, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Luke's face drained of color as realization set in. The smug expression that had been plastered across his face moments before was gone, replaced by shock and disbelief. He took a step back, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words that didn't come. I didn't know," Luke stammered, his voice faltering. His arrogance, which had been so strong just moments ago, quickly evaporated. He was no longer the confident waiter in control of the situation. He was just a man who had deeply misjudged the moment and had made a grave mistake. "I'm so sorry, sir," Luke continued, attempting to salvage the situation. I wasn't." His words were a jumble of panic and regret, but they carried no weight anymore. The damage had already been done. But Marcus's father didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to shout to make his presence felt. His composure radiated power as he took a slow, deliberate step toward Luke, his gaze unwavering. "I've built this business from the ground up," Marcus's father continued. "I've worked for every inch of success, and I've made sure this place operates on respect for every guest and employee, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room seemed to hold its breath. The restaurant, which had been full of murmurs just moments ago, now felt empty except for the weight of the reality dawning on Luke. He had no place to hide now. The truth was out in the open. He was no longer the man who had stood behind the bar, judging others for not fitting into his narrow view of who belonged in his world. Now he was exposed. Luke's attempts to backpedal became more frantic. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered, his hands twitching nervously. "I was just following the rules. I thought he wasn't—" But nothing he said mattered. His excuses fell flat as the weight of his actions hit him harder than any reprimand could. The other patrons, who had been watching silently, started to whisper again. Their voices were soft at first, hesitant, but the whispers soon grew louder as the truth spread through the room. Some were uncomfortable. Others watched in stunned silence. Marcus's father, standing with quiet authority, had exposed the prejudices that had been at play, and it left the room feeling heavy with the uncomfortable truth. Marcus, standing by his father, wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting or calling for a scene. He simply turned to Luke, his voice steady but powerful. "I didn't deserve to be treated that way," he said softly. "No one does." His words hung in the air, and the effect was immediate. The room, which had been tense and uneasy, now seemed to breathe again. There was a weight to what Marcus had said. It wasn't just about him. It was about the systemic discrimination that so often went unnoticed, ignored, or accepted as normal. Luke stood there, still frozen in shock. He had underestimated Marcus, assumed he was just another young, wealthy patron, and used his position to belittle and demean. But now, in the face of the truth and justice, he couldn't deny the mistake he had made. The guilt was written all over his face, and for the first time he was forced to confront the bias that had shaped his actions. As the whispers died down, Marcus's father gave Luke one last look, his eyes calm but stern. "You'll be leaving now," he said simply, his voice as composed as ever. "And we'll make sure no one else makes this mistake." Luke, utterly defeated, simply nodded. He turned and quickly left the room, his head down, knowing that this incident would follow him far beyond the restaurant doors. The tension that had lingered in the air finally began to lift, and as the patrons resumed their meals, there was an unspoken sense of justice, a quiet victory for Marcus. His father stood by him, not with anger, but with respect, for his son, for the situation, and for the truth that had finally come to light. Marcus, having stood up for himself and seen the power of his voice, walked out of the restaurant a little taller, his heart a little lighter, knowing that sometimes it takes one moment of courage to change everything. Marcus and his father stood in the center of the dining room, the tension in the air so thick it felt like everyone in the restaurant was holding their breath. The soft clink of silverware and murmurs from the tables had faded into the background, replaced by the silence of Luke Harris standing there, now completely at a loss for words. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Marcus's father, who had remained calm throughout the exchange, now shifted his tone, no longer simply correcting Luke, but delivering the final blow that would change everything. "You've done more harm than you realize," Marcus's father said, his voice unwavering but carrying the weight of truth. "The way you treated my son is unforgivable, and it's a reflection of how you treat others in this establishment. I'm afraid you've lost the privilege of working here." The words hung in the air, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. Luke stood there, silent and frozen, as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. His career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, gone in an instant. His face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing. But no, words came. He couldn't understand it. He couldn't process it. His arrogance had been his shield, and now it had shattered before him. I didn't mean to. I wasn't. Luke's voice faltered as he stumbled over his words, his hands trembling slightly. He was trying to hold on to some sense of control, but it was slipping through his fingers. Marcus's father didn't let him continue. You've had plenty of chances to see the way your actions affect others, and you chose not to. I've seen the way you treat people, the way you talk to them, like they don't matter. His gaze was piercing, his disappointment palpable. I will not tolerate someone like you in my restaurant, representing everything we stand against. Luke looked from Marcus's father to Marcus, his gaze now filled with regret. It was clear that he had never expected to face such consequences for what had, in his mind, been a small mistake. He had misjudged Marcus, his identity, his worth, and, most devastating of all, his right to be treated with respect. His worldview had been narrow, built on the assumption that status and appearance determined who was deserving of dignity. Now, that perspective was being dismantled right before his eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Luke tried again, but this time his words were drowned out by the weight of what he had done. Marcus's father, still composed but firm, continued, You've just confirmed what my son has to deal with every day of his life. You may have thought you were teaching him a lesson, but in reality, you were teaching yourself one. And, unfortunately for you, it's come too late. Luke swallowed hard, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. He was speechless, unable to accept the gravity of his actions. His arrogance, which had so often fueled his interactions, had backfired, and now he had nowhere to hide. Marcus, who had stood quietly by his father, took a deep breath, feeling the shift inside him. The anger that had once bubbled beneath the surface was now replaced with clarity. He didn't need to say more. His father's words had done the work, but Marcus couldn't help but add one last thing. His voice was calm, yet powerful. I didn't deserve to be treated that way, he said softly but with conviction. And neither does anyone else. As Marcus spoke, Luke's eyes dropped to the floor. The reality of what he had done settled in, and he realized just how far his actions had reached. Not only had he humiliated Marcus, but he had tarnished the reputation of the restaurant he worked for, and worse, exposed his own biases for everyone to see. It wasn't just the direct harm he'd caused Marcus, it was the longer-term damage to the atmosphere of the restaurant. Luke's behavior had revealed an underlying systemic issue, one that went beyond him. It wasn't just about a single waiter or a single instance. It was about how people in positions of power, whether they're waiters, teachers, or anyone else, could sometimes act on prejudices without realizing the harm they were causing. Luke had never questioned his own assumptions before, and now it had come crashing down on him. The patrons who had been watching the exchange now looked at Luke with different eyes. Some of them exchanged glances of discomfort, while others seemed to realize for the first time the subtle power dynamics that shaped their experiences in this space. It wasn't just about wealth or class, it was about respect. And in this moment, the lessons were clear. Prejudice, no matter how subtle, would never be tolerated. Respect, no matter how small, would always win out. Luke, once the figure of authority in his role, was now left to confront the truth of his actions. Shamed, regretful, and standing at the edge of losing everything. His career was now hanging by a thread, his confidence shattered, and for the first time in a long time, he truly saw the consequences of his behavior. The power dynamics had shifted. The lesson was clear. It wasn't just about the apology he could offer now. It was about changing, about looking inside and truly confronting the biases that had driven him for so long. Luke Harris's career, once firmly grounded in his self-assured role as a waiter in an upscale restaurant, came crashing down with Marcus's father's revelation. As soon as he was told that he would be fired, the realization hit Luke hard. His arrogance and prejudices had just destroyed everything he had worked for. The patrons who had witnessed his behavior now saw him for who he truly was, and the weight of that recognition was enough to ruin his reputation. Luke's attempts to apologize fell on deaf ears. His shame was palpable as he gathered his belongings and left the restaurant for the last time. The experience served as a wake-up call. It made him see how his actions, fueled by unconscious bias, had hurt not only Marcus but also tainted the very values of the restaurant he had once taken so much pride in. It was clear that he could never undo the damage, but the incident would haunt him, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked discrimination and prejudice. For Marcus, the entire event became a turning point. Watching his father stand up with such dignity and calm authority, Marcus began to realize that standing up for himself wasn't just about getting back at people who mistreated him. It was about asserting his own dignity. He had always felt undervalued and misunderstood, especially when he entered spaces like this one, but in that moment, he knew that he deserved respect just as much as anyone else. His confidence grew as he stood beside his father, seeing the change that had unfolded in that restaurant. He understood that asserting your voice and owning your identity wasn't about being loud or aggressive. It was about being true to yourself, regardless of how others perceived you. Marcus took pride in who he was, in his talents, in his heritage, and in his ability to stand firm against discrimination. The experience changed him, not just in how he interacted with the world, but in how he saw himself. He was no longer someone who would silently absorb microaggressions. He was someone who would stand up and fight for the respect he deserved. Meanwhile, David, Marcus's father, realized that the battle didn't stop with one incident. Though Luke had been fired, the incident revealed a deeper issue within the restaurant and the industry as a whole. It wasn't enough for him to simply address the situation with Luke. David wanted to ensure that such prejudices would never again seep into the way his business was run. He immediately began implementing new policies aimed at creating a more inclusive and respectful environment for both staff and patrons. David introduced training programs focusing on cultural sensitivity, anti-bias education, and conflict resolution for all employees. He wanted to ensure that every single person who walked into his restaurant, whether an employee or a guest, felt valued, respected, and heard. He took these steps not just for the sake of his reputation, but because he believed that the restaurant had a responsibility to lead by example. He had the power to create change, and he wasn't going to let this moment pass by without turning it into a catalyst for positive change. The message was clear. True justice isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about empowering individuals to stand up for themselves, and about creating systems that allow for growth and understanding. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, but also offering them the chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. It's about making spaces where all voices, regardless of race, background, or identity, are heard and respected. The story of Marcus, his father, and Luke taught everyone who witnessed it that prejudices and biases do not define someone's worth or place in the world. The actions of one person, whether Marcus standing up to the injustice or David taking proactive steps in his business, showed that change is possible when people make an effort to do what's right. The message was simple. Respect, accountability, and empowerment are the cornerstones of justice. These qualities help build a society where everyone, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to shine, to speak, and to be heard. As Marcus and his father left the restaurant that day, there was no need for words of triumph. The moment had already spoken volumes. Justice isn't about silencing others. It's about giving them the freedom to be heard and shine in their own right. Have you ever witnessed someone break free from judgment and show their true strength? Share your story in the comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo and inspire real change. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge how we view justice, equality, and the power of self-expression. You won't want to miss it.